This channel is part of the History Hit network.
Early on the morning of the 16th of April, 1746, a British army began striking camp at Nairn in the north of Scotland. Ahead of it lay a crucial battle, not against a foreign foe, but against a rebellious army which threatened to wreck the fragile union between Scotland and England and to strangle the British Empire at birth. One of the protagonists in this struggle was William, Duke of Cumberland, second son of George II. The other was his cousin, the young pretender, Charles Edward Stuart, better known as Bonnie Prince Charlie. They were to meet on Culloden Moor. A terrible defeat of the Highland clans at Culloden Moor is all too often seen simply as a battle between the Scots and the English, or even as the dramatic death throes of the old Gaelic world. In fact, it was no more than the last great act in the fall of the royal house of Stuart, a sad and bloody tragedy which brought pain and suffering to every corner of the British Isles. If we are really to understand why British troops came to fight a Highland army on a barren stretch of moorland outside Inverness, we must go back more than 100 years to the Great Civil War in the reign of the first Charles Stuart, Charles I, the great-grandfather of Bonnie Prince Charlie. The House of Stuart became the first dynasty to sit upon the combined throne of the two kingdoms of Scotland and England, when James VI of Scotland and First of England succeeded a childless Elizabeth I to the throne in 1603. James was canny enough to avoid alienating his people, but his son Charles mismanaged his rule to such an extent that a civil war resulted, which led Charles to his execution in 1649. Britain's only military dictatorship, headed by Oliver Cromwell, followed. And despite the fact that Charles II was restored to the throne in 1660, the sacred chains of absolute monarchy were broken. The divine right of kings had been challenged, and this truth was apparent to all. A sovereign now ruled only by the consent of his people. With the overthrow of Charles I, the people had removed one unsuitable ruler. In 1688, they were to do it again. Within 3 short years of his ascent to the throne, the second son of Charles I, James II, had alienated his people as surely as his father had done at the time of the English Civil War. James was a convert to Catholicism, a religion which most Britons loathed with a passion which is not easy for our modern, more secular society to understand. In the 17th and 18th centuries, the Church enjoyed far more influence than it does today, and consequently, the form and manner of worship was far more important to ordinary people. Scotland and England were both overwhelmingly Protestant. The older Catholic religion survived in only small pockets in the north of England and around the Gaelic fringes of Scotland and Ireland. Catholics in general were feared and distrusted, and a Catholic king was therefore regarded with great suspicion. At first, James was tolerated by the people, but in 1688, the birth of a Catholic son and heir caused the crisis which saw him toppled in the bloodless series of events known as the Glorious Revolution of 1688. James II was replaced by his Protestant daughter, Mary, and her husband, William of Orange. But from his exile in France, James plotted to regain the throne. Support for the return of a Catholic monarch was non-existent in most of Britain, so James raised his standard in Catholic Ireland and called for a simultaneous uprising in Scotland. This rising was to lead to the battles of Killiecrankie and the Boyne. Today, the events of the Boyne still shape the face of politics in Northern Ireland, but their immediate effect was to send the defeated King James back into exile, this time for good.
Discover the past with exclusive history documentaries from History Hit and uncover the secrets of some of the most famous people and events in history. History Hit gives you access to a growing range of documentaries presented by and featuring historians at the forefront of research and debate. Whether you are looking to find out more about charismatic leaders like Cleopatra or to discover the story behind the Industrial Revolution, History Hit will have something for you. We also aim to bring you the stories and legends that shaped our world through our award-winning podcast network. Sign up now for a free trial, and Absolute History fans get 50% off their first 3 months. Just be sure to use the code AbsoluteHistory at checkout.
With his death in 1701, the claim to the throne passed to his son, also named James, who would have become James III, but was to become better known to posterity as the Old Pretender. The young James grew restless as he watched the unfavourable events in Britain from his exile in France. The successor to William and Mary, Queen Anne, died in 1714, and Parliament offered the crown to George, Elector of Hanover, a staunch Protestant. The change of dynasty further weakened the Stuart cause, but it was not universally popular. And many government opponents were drawn towards the Jacobite camp, which came to be viewed as the natural party of opposition. Sensing the time to be right, the Pretender too pinned his hopes of regaining his throne on the Celtic fringes of Britain. In 1715, the Scottish clans obligingly rose in arms once again, at this time in support of the man who would have been James III. The Jacobite rebellion of 715, however, fared no better than James II's ill-fated attempt in 1689. Popular support was low, and after the indecisive battle of Sheriffmuir, the rebellion dwindled away. Arriving in Scotland only after the battle had been fought, James quickly fled back into exile. Were it not for the blood which was spilt, the story of the next Jacobite rising would contain more than a little element of farce. In 1719, another attempt by the Pretender to regain his throne by rising in Scotland failed even more ignominiously. This time, Spanish help had been enlisted, but the main Spanish invasion fleet was scattered by a great storm, and the rising of 1719 ended in a half-hearted battle at Glenshiel. By any sensible reckoning, the pretensions of the Stuarts to the throne of Britain should now have been dead and buried. They had made 3 full-blooded attempts, all of which were failures. But there was still one last act to be played in the tragedy. In 1743, Britain and France became embroiled in yet another major war. Despite all their previous experiences, the Jacobites had long been planning another rising. This time, the French agreed to help, seeking to destabilize Britain at home. Now nearly 60 years of age, the Old Pretender sensibly passed up the prospect of a further forlorn attempt at a prize which was obviously well beyond his reach. However, French military help was promised. So his son, the 25-year-old Prince Charles, with the rashness of youth, was prepared to stake everything on one last throw of the dice. In an eerie echo of the storm which had wrecked the Spanish fleet gathered to support his father in 1719, a second storm now wrecked the French invasion fleet, which had been assembled to assist the prince's cause in 1744. But Charles Edward Stuart was clearly no respecter of omens, and undaunted by the loss of his fleet, he decided to carry on and lead an uprising without substantial French military help.
The basic problem for the whole of the Bonnie Prince Charles's cause in the 45 was a lack of popular support he received in Scotland, above all. It is not always realised only 6 clans actually rallied to him. The rest either stayed passive or rallied to the government. And when he got down into England, it was much the same. Although there were plenty of Jacobite sympathisers in England, except at Manchester, there was no sign of real rallying to his cause. So it is that the failure to really inspire a widespread movement, I think, made it impossible for him to win in the long term. Bonnie Prince Charlie, of course, inherited certain traits from his ancestors. Both Charles I and James II, for example, were absolutely pig-headed and stubborn as mules. And I think we have to say that Bonnie Prince Charlie was that as well, at several times in this adventure. The other side of the coin is, of course, that the King George II was very popular at this period. He'd been the last King of England ever to serve on the battlefield at the Battle of Dettingen in 1743. He spoke English, which his father, George I, had never done. And there's no doubt he was a popular monarch. So once again, there was no appeal against an unpopular foreign ruler to be background for the Jacobite cause.
Charles and a handful of companions sailed in just 2 ships, but yet more ill luck followed in his wake. 100 miles west of Cornwall, they were intercepted by HMS Lion. In a 5-hour battle, the Lion and the larger of Charles' 2 ships, the Elizabeth, were reduced to little more than floating wrecks. Needless to say, the Elizabeth carried the bulk of the arms for the planned rising. As she limped back to a French harbour, the young pretender must have felt more exposed than ever. If his resolve was tested by the loss of the Elizabeth and her vital cargo, it was strained to breaking point by his reception in Scotland. Landing with only 7 companions at Arisaig, on the west coast of Scotland, the prince did not give the appearance of a man about to lead a triumphant crusade. The clan chiefs had agreed to support a rising in the belief that they would be assisting an invasion by French regular troops. In fact, the prince had landed amongst them without a single French grenadier at his back. Now that it was obvious that the entire burden of the venture would fall upon the Highland clans, a number of the most influential chiefs wisely withdrew their support. A shrewder man might have abandoned the scheme at that point, but undaunted and with the flawed judgment which typified the house of Stuart, the young pretender soldiered on. Here at Glenfinnan, on the 19th of August 1745, his standard was raised, more in hope than expectation. Much against their better judgment, Cameron of Lochiel and the MacDonalds of Glengarry, Keppoch and Clanranald brought in their followers. The 45 had begun. Once raised, this small army marched on Edinburgh. As they marched southwards, additional numbers came in, and one of those who joined them was an Edinburgh merchant's son, a well-connected man named James Johnson.
As soon as the news of the Prince's landing was confirmed at Edinburgh, I immediately repaired to the house of Lord Rollo, the father-in-law of my sister, there to await the arrival of the Prince at Perth. And on the 6th of September I left it, accompanied by the 2 Misses Rollo, who presented me to their relations, the Duke of Perth and Lord George Murray. On my arrival, I was greatly surprised to find so few followers with the Prince, as public report at Edinburgh had increased them to a prodigious number. The Prince appointed Lord George and the Duke of Perth as his lieutenant generals. Lord George proposed that I should be his aide-de-camp, which proposal I accepted and began immediately to enter on the exercise of the duties attached to the situation. Night and day, my occupations were incessant, and I could scarcely find the time to sleep 2 hours in the 24.
The Jacobites whom Johnson joined were often referred to as the Highland Army, and the majority of them wore Highland clothes, whether they spoke the Gaelic or not. Most Highlanders joined in the rebellion because they had been ordered to do so by their clan chiefs. Some came willingly, but others had to be forced out under the threat of having their homes burnt and their cattle taken. A clan chief exercised a frightening authority over his tenants and followers. He expected, and usually got, absolute obedience. One of those forced out was a carpenter from near Drumnadrochit, named Andrew Urquhart, who later gave this testimony at his trial.
as de hoshi cogich culloden, and ag dul ni go las loch Gary. Agus ní sé go dúne glyn urchard, gus nígach iad coolerísh a habos gan a Francia, and ag fugin Jonach, ag va tor nach roch, gus an grauch a go rísh a Kionark, gelaf loch Gary roke you. Hunig mi dúne gur hoorder fallaf, agus a gra gummiarlach bas a huich. Na a hoord stiach gianna Kionark, hure bulle, was stoken gunna an log hon talave, agus lon falla.
At first, the Jacobites could muster only some 1,200 men, but their support was growing. The commander of the British troops in Scotland, General Sir John Cope, therefore took a difficult decision. He had two choices. Either he could stand fast and defend the line of the Forth, as the Duke of Argyll had done against the Jacobites in 1715, or he could march into the Highlands to nip the rebellion in the bud, as General Whiteman had done in 1719. The first option was out of the question. It meant abandoning most of Scotland to the Jacobites, and the rising might then take months to suppress. Cope therefore marched northwards, hoping to enlist the support of the Protestant Highland clans, who were sympathetic to the government. To his dismay, he found none of the pro-government clans were willing to support him. Although the vast majority of the Scottish population were opposed to the Jacobites, they were indifferent in the matter of actually taking up arms against them. So with the Jacobites rapidly gaining strength, Cope was forced to turn aside rather than risk a battle. He therefore made for Aberdeen. With Cope out of the way, the road to the south now lay open, and the Jacobites raced southwards to Edinburgh, which they captured on the 17th of September. Edinburgh had once been known as the Geneva of the North, and one English observer, a member of the Privy Council, named Stephen Poyntz, commented upon its fall with some astonishment. That a nation like Scotland, which makes a strict profession of the Protestant religion and values itself on respecting the sanctity of an oath, should suffer the pretender's son with a handful of rabble to walk the Protestant succession out of the kingdom without lifting up a single weapon or hand against him, is astonishing to the last degree, and fills one with dreadful apprehension for the behaviour of England. Had the town of Edinburgh made good the profession of their address, they might easily have destroyed such an undisciplined crew from the windows of their high stone houses. But how far it may now be in Sir John Cope's power to dislodge them, or how far it may be practicable for him with his handful of men to engage them now they are strengthened, I tremble to think. Relatively few of the Highlanders who occupied Edinburgh actually carried the broadswords and targes with which they are usually depicted. Broadswords were expensive, and generally speaking, only the Highland gentlemen in the front ranks carried them. The first Jacobite forces were very makeshift in character. Patrick Crichton, an Edinburgh burgess, recalled the Jacobites, whom he had seen during the occupation of Edinburgh.
I entered the town by the Bristol port, which I saw to my indignation in the keeping of these caterpillars. A boy stood with a rusty drawn sword, and two fellows with things like guns of the 16th century sat on each side of the entry to the poorhouse, and these were catching the vermin from the lurking places about their plaids and throwing them away. I said to Mr. Jardine, Minister of Liberton, "Are these the scoundrels who have surprised Edinburgh by treachery?" He answered, "I'd rather seen it in the hands of Frenchmen, but the devil and the deep sea are both as bad." The officers with their troops in rank and file marched from the Parliament Close down to the cross with their bagpipes and their lousy crew, and they made a circle around it. I observed their arms. There were guns of different sizes, and some of enormous length, some with butts turned up like a herring's tail, some tied with pack thread to the stock, and some matchlocks. Some had swords instead of guns, one or two had pitchforks, and some bits of scythes upon pole with a hook, and some old Lochaber axes.
As the Jacobites settled down to the occupation of the capital, General Cope had meanwhile found enough shipping to take his army south by sea. He had hoped to retake Edinburgh, but instead his troops were surprised and routed by the Highland army in less than 10 minutes at the Battle of Prestonpans, early on the morning of the 21st of September, 1745. Scotland was now secure, and Charles' father was proclaimed James VIII of Scotland. But at this moment of triumph, the first signs of dissent began to appear in the ranks of the Highland army. They had won Scotland for the Stuarts, and many felt they had discharged their obligation to the prince, and accordingly quit the ranks to head home. However, Charles Edward Stuart had his sights firmly set on the English throne as well. Still unsupported by French troops, he viewed his Highland army as the only option for regaining that throne too. But even the prince himself must have suspected its unsuitability for the job. Nonetheless, the news of the easy victory at Prestonpans swelled the Jacobite ranks, and within a month, the Jacobite army mustered over 5,000 men. Against the express wishes of many of the Highland chiefs, on the 1st of November 1745, Edinburgh was abandoned, and the invasion of England began. The invasion progressed rapidly, and the Jacobites were soon in control of Manchester. The youthful Duke of Cumberland, with a substantial field army, tried to intercept the Jacobites near Lichfield, but they slipped by him, and by the 4th of December were at Derby, only 127 miles from London. Panic swept the capital, and there was a run on the Bank of England. The mood of desperation and spreading terror was captured by Hogarth in this famous scene. Londoners may have been terrified, but the French were delighted with the news from England. Hasty orders were given to mount a force to send across the Channel to assist the Jacobites. However, some French generals argued that the troops should go to Flanders to fight the British army there instead. Although some French regulars would ultimately be sent to help the Jacobites, they would not arrive for some time. While the French prevaricated, the Jacobite army halted at Derby. There, the young pretender and his officers argued for 2 days about what to do next. Charles was for pushing on to London, but the others disagreed. They pointed out that the French had still not landed, and that, crucially, there was no sign of real support from the English population. A rational man could see that they could not possibly hope to capture London, a city of 1 million inhabitants with just 5,000 men. In the end, Charles had to accept their decision. But he evermore considered himself betrayed by the Highlanders, and increasingly relied upon his Irish Quartermaster General, John William O'Sullivan, in preference to the Highland chiefs, represented by Lord George Murray.
The problems of the Highland High Command really split down into two. First of all, there was the prince himself. Although he had a fairly high idea of his abilities, got totally from reading books, I might say, as a soldier. In fact, he'd never been on any active service at all in his life. He'd once attended, as a young teenager, a siege on the continent as a spectator, but he really believed that streak of Stuart's stubbornness that he knew it all, and therefore he did not need all that much guidance. But the second problem, which compounded the first one, was the fact that his staff, if we can call it that, and his entourage, were divided into two warring parties, which were daggers drawn with one another. On the one side, there was Lord George Murray, who was by far the most able soldier in the Jacobite entourage. And then there was, of course, O'Sullivan, the famous quartermaster general of the army, who in the end Prince Charles decided to favour, because he talks more and more from Derby onwards about treachery, how he's being betrayed by both the English and, above all, the Scots, not rising in big enough numbers. So he tended to swing behind this rather inadequate person, who was not a good quartermaster general, never mind a strategist, who was, of course, an exile like he had been himself. As Napoleon would say, a generation and more later, better one bad general than two good ones. And this division of command, therefore, within the army of the Bonnie Prince Charlie, was a fatal complication.
With the fateful decision to turn north, although few could have known it, the Jacobite cause had reached its high water mark. On the 6th of December, the army turned around and began retreating northwards. Still expecting the Jacobites to move on London, Cumberland had planned to fight them near Coventry, and he was taken completely by surprise by the sudden change of direction. So the Highland army had almost reached Scotland before he managed to re-establish contact. But just as Cumberland reached the Jacobite forces, a false report of a French invasion sent him scurrying southwards toward London again. Unhindered for the moment, the Jacobites made for Glasgow, and there laid siege to Stirling Castle. General Henry Hawley attempted to relieve the garrison, but he was defeated in a hard-fought battle outside Falkirk on the 17th of January. Despite the fact that it is normally regarded as a Jacobite victory, the Battle of Falkirk nonetheless gave the Jacobites something of a fright. While most of Hawley's army ran away, some government regiments, for the first time in the rebellion, stood firm against the Highlanders, who faltered in the face of their resistance. By now, a small contingent of French regulars had finally arrived in Scotland to assist the Jacobites, and it was this detachment which saw off the government troops and thus won the battle for Charles. Unfortunately, these were the only French troops to be sent to assist the 45. The French invasion had again been called off, and the Duke of Cumberland hurried north again to take over Hawley's defeated army. His arrival was received with great enthusiasm. In the name of his father, King George II, he set out to destroy the Jacobites once and for all. All of the predictions that the rising was bound to fail without French help were now coming true. Rather than risk another battle, the prince bowed to pressure from the Highland chiefs, and the Jacobites retreated northwards to Inverness. Cumberland pursued them slowly, halting for a month at Aberdeen. But on the 8th of April, he left the borough, and within 6 days was at Nairn, only a few miles short of the Jacobite headquarters at Inverness. The speed of Cumberland's sudden advance caught the Jacobites by surprise. Although many of their best men were away, there was no real option left but to fight. So on the morning of the 14th of April, 1746, they marched out from Inverness, prepared to take up their battle positions on Culloden Moor. But the government army did not appear that day, nor the next. The 15th of April was Cumberland's birthday, and to celebrate, he gave his army a day's rest at Nairn, before committing them to the battle on the 16th. On the 15th of April, while the Jacobites waited in vain for the British army to advance, they hatched a desperate plan. The Jacobite leaders supposed that as his men were celebrating the Duke's birthday, they were likely, as Lord George put it, to be drunk as beggars. They therefore agreed the ill-fated plan to secretly advance on Cumberland's army by night and mount a dawn attack on the sleeping camp. This was to result in the infamous all-night march, which preceded the Battle of Culloden. About 8 p.m. on the night of April the 15th, the whole Jacobite army set off, hoping to surprise the government camp at Nairn, 8 miles distant. But by the first light, they were still 2 miles short of their objective, and it was clear that the British army would be ready and waiting for them in broad daylight. Lord George Murray therefore abandoned the attempt and ordered his men back to Culloden. The prince was furious, but there was nothing to be done. After a night spent blundering around in the darkness, all that had been achieved was to exhaust his men on the eve of their greatest trial. Worse still, the Jacobites' makeshift supply system couldn't provide food for the returning army. Dispirited, tired and hungry, large numbers wandered off in the vain hope of finding some food, while others simply sought to sleep. For many, it would be their last.
Exhausted with hunger and worn out with the fatigue of the last 3 nights, I turned off as fast as I could to Inverness, there to recruit my strength with a little sleep. But when I already had one leg in the bed and was on the point of stretching myself between the sheets, what was my surprise to hear the drumbeat to arms and the trumpet sounding the call to boot and saddle. I hurried on my clothes, my eyes half shut, and mounting a horse instantly repaired to our army on the eminence where we had remained for 3 days, and from which we saw the British army at a distance of 2 miles, in movement towards us.
The battlefield, upon which the two armies faced each other, was a broad ridge of moorland, 5 miles to the southeast of Inverness. The Jacobites took up position between 2 sets of wall parks. On their right, the Culwiniac Park, stretching down to the river, and on their left, the walls of the Culloden Parks. The moor to their front was flat and open, ideal for the fearsome Highland charge, which had brought victory at Prestonpans and Falkirk. By the time of Culloden, the Highland army was more conventionally equipped, and most had French muskets and bayonets, though the front rank still kept their swords and targes. The Highland method of fighting, however, was still very different from that of the red-coated regulars opposite. They had neither the training nor, indeed, sufficient ammunition to engage in protracted exchanges of musket fire. Instead, led by the swordsmen in the front ranks, they came down to within musket shot, fired a single volley, and then ran in with sword and shield, hoping to induce panic in the enemy ranks. This was the famous Highland charge.
A Highland charge is usually seen as a bunch of men in kilts bounding over the heather, waving swords, axes and all sorts of wonderful things, which they then proceed to literally carve the opposition apart. In actual fact, it didn't really work that way. It worked on panic. They'd come hurtling down, great big mob, and literally frighten the living daylights out of the enemy, who'd promptly turn, run away, and then die in the hundreds, tens of hundreds, and so on and so forth. This worked well at Prestonpans, didn't work quite so well at Falkirk, but at Culloden it all went wrong, mainly because it's so far to come. There's about 500 yards there, and all the time they're being fired on, first by cannon firing round shot, then grape shot, then muskets. The redcoats saw them coming, they had time, they stood their ground, and although the Highlanders did break in on the right flank, really it hadn't worked. The main tactic of frightening the opposition hadn't worked, and the bayonets in the end won the battle.
Behind the Highland regiments, in the front rank of the Jacobite army, stood a second line of Lowland Scots regiments, stiffened by 2 regiments of French regulars. One was called the Irish Pickets, and the other was the blue-jacketed Royal Écossais, or Royal Scots. Many of the men serving in both these regiments were deserters from the British Army, and would face summary justice after the battle. All in all, the Jacobites ought to have mustered some 6,500 infantry. In addition, there were a smaller number of cavalrymen and gunners. Unfortunately, far too many of the Highlanders had straggled off in search of food and shelter, and the Jacobite army probably amounted to little more than 4,000 infantry on the field that day. In front of the Jacobite line were placed 11 3-pounder cannon, and it was these ill-fated guns which would signal the commencement of the battle. On the other side of the moor, Cumberland had some 6,500 infantry drawn up in 2 lines. He also had a regiment of government Highlanders, the Argyll militia, together with 14 troops of mounted dragoons on his flanks. Unlike the civilians manning the cannon of the Jacobites, all of Cumberland's artillerymen were well-trained professionals who handled the guns with deadly efficiency. At this period, firepower normally decided the outcome of regular battles, but sometimes it was not enough, and the soldier then had to turn to his bayonet, which was a fearsome weapon. Utilizing the lessons from Prestonpans and Falkirk, at Culloden, a departure on the normal bayonet drill was used. Instead of lunging straight forward at the man in front of him, who would be protected by a shield, each soldier was trained to thrust instead at the swordsman attacking the man on his right. By doing this, he would have a clean thrust at the unprotected right-hand side of the Highlander. This new drill was to prove itself deadly effective in a very few short hours. The British Army, which was to fight on Culloden Moor, is often pictured as being composed of the very dregs of society, led by aristocratic officers who despise their men. In actual fact, it was in many ways surprisingly similar to the modern British Army. The rank and file took a fierce pride in their regiments, and their officers were dedicated professional soldiers. There were, however, some men who were not there by choice, known as vestrymen. They were petty criminals delivered up by their parishers to serve until the end of the rebellion. Unwanted and ill-disciplined, they were to play a sinister role after the battle. But there were as many honest men in the ranks, a very high proportion of them Scots. Standing in the British front line was a Royal Scots Fusilier named Edward Lynn. Afterwards, he wrote to his wife, telling her what he saw that day.
We waded up to our knees in glass, through the mere with a good well to be at them, and they winter considering we've been through this winter. Before we engaged, it rained half a sair, both hail and rain, the strong wind were backs. But just then they began to fire their big guns, it grew into an half a fine like day. Then the Duke rode through our front line just before we begun, and desired us all nae to be feared of her. Depend, my lads, on your bayonets, says he. Let them ken the men they hae to deal with. Aye, well, we did.
Sometime around midday, one of Cumberland's staff officers, Lord Bury, rode forward to count the Jacobite guns, and was fired on by two of them. The government artillery fired back, and the battle was begun. The ill-served Jacobite guns were soon silenced, and for as long as the Highlanders stood their ground, the government artillery kept up a steady rhythm of 1 round a minute with the 10 guns. No one knows how long the Highlanders stood facing the bombardment. It could have been for as little as 10 minutes or as many as 20. But they had to endure it because hundreds of men were still hurrying to the moor to rejoin their regiments. This delay was exacerbated by the unwillingness of the prince to give the order to attack. The Jacobite commanders hoped to delay their charge until as many of the men as possible had rejoined their colours. But although the effects of the government artillery were galling to the Jacobites, it was to be General Hawley's dragoons and the government Highlanders who eventually forced their hand and precipitated the Highland charge.
One of the big stories about Culloden is the fact the Highlanders stood for so long being fired on by the government artillery. In some accounts it suggested most of the Highlanders died up on the back on the ridge there, where the red flag is, fired on by the government artillery, while Bonnie Prince Charlie sat dithering, wondering what to do. In fact, this was not really a problem. It was if you got hit by a cannonball, of course, but in military terms the cannonade was not very effective. The guns were knocking over on average about 1 man with every shot fired. They had 10 guns, each one firing about once a minute. With a cannonade lasting only about a quarter of an hour, that's not killing very many Jacobites. Where the killing really started was once they got down close to the government line and the artillerymen switched from firing cannonballs to firing grape shot, which is effectively a bag full of musket balls, worked like a shotgun. Now that did kill people.
As the Jacobite army stood immobile, awaiting the order to charge, General Hawley ordered his 4 companies of Argyllshire Highlanders to break down the walls in the enclosure on the Jacobite right flank in order to let the dragoons through to attack them. Soon, he was threatening the right flank and rear of the Jacobite army. A brief respite was gained for the Jacobites when Lord Lewis Gordon's 2 Lowland battalions from Aberdeen swung around to face the approaching dragoons. But faced with this threat, the order was given for a general assault on Cumberland's position while there was still time.
What is not always realised is how multinational both of the armies at the battlefield of Culloden were. Take, for example, Bonnie Prince Charlie's army. He had Irish, he had Frenchmen present. And of course he had a few lowland troops, although the great majority of the Scots were Highlanders, of course, from the clans. Strangely enough, you get exactly the same social or national mixture of forces within the army of Cumberland, the Royal Army. Of the 16 regiments which made up the bulk of Cumberland's army, no less than 4, or 1 man in for a quarter, were in fact Scottish regiments.
Despite the cosmopolitan makeup of the Jacobite army, the principal tactic was still the Highland charge. Over the past 100 years, yelling mobs of clansmen had inspired fear and panic amongst regular troops on a score of battlefields. But at Culloden, it was to prove a disastrous failure. The moor was not as featureless as it might at first have appeared. The Inverness road ran diagonally across it from the bottom corner of the Culloden Park to O'Learnach, and the ground between the road and the British Army was wet and boggy. The armies were drawn up 500 yards apart, a comparatively long distance to charge over, especially over difficult terrain. As the Jacobites set off towards the British lines, the Highland left, made up of MacDonald's regiments, blundered into the morass, while those in the centre desperately tried to avoid it by swinging to their right. Unfortunately, they had once collided with Lord George Murray's right wing, which was itself veering to the left in order to avoid the Learnach enclosure wall. For a moment, they were all brought to a confused halt, and Cumberland's gunners, switching from round shot to canister, lacerated the stationary jumble of men with hundreds of musket balls. After this pause, the Camerons and Macintoshes led the Jacobites on again, so that the whole weight of the attack fell upon just 1 battalion, Barrow's 4th of Foot, now the King's Own Royal Border Regiment. The men of Barrow's battalion fought back savagely, but were overwhelmed by sheer weight of numbers, losing one of their colours and nearly a third of their strength in killed and wounded. However, 2 regiments from the government's second line were ordered by a watchful Cumberland to march up to attack the Jacobite flank, while 2 more, including Sempill Scott's borderers, engaged them from the front. The Jacobites were brought to a halt for a second time, jammed in a dense column that was estimated by contemporary accounts to be as many as 20 or 30 men deep. Those at the front had already fired or thrown away their muskets. Now they could only reply with pistols or even with stones. Some were even shot down from behind by their own men further back in the column. There was now ranged around them some 1,700 well-drilled soldiers who proceeded to fire 5 or 6 volleys into the column at point-blank range. In the space of just 2 terrible minutes, 800 clansmen were killed or wounded, and the macabre outline of that massive column can still be traced today in the great slough of graves, stretching southwards from the Well of Dead on Culloden Moor. Such merciless slaughter could not continue. Faced with those terrible point-blank volleys of musketry, some Jacobites began surrendering, but most of the survivors turned and ran back across the moor. On the other flank of the Highland army, the MacDonalds struggled to within 20 yards of Cumberland's men, but then the relentless musket fire of the Royal Scots and 13th Foot brought them to a complete halt. Not one of the MacDonalds even reached the British line. Then, seeing the rest of the Highlanders falling back, the MacDonald men ran too, and Captain Johnson went with them.
We were on the left of our army, and at the distance of about 20 paces when the rout began to become general. In a rage, I discharged my blunderbuss and pistols at the enemy, and immediately endeavoured to save myself like the rest. But having charged on foot and in boots, I was so overcome by the marshy ground that instead of running, I could scarcely walk. All at once, I perceived a horse without a rider, about 30 paces before me. I ran and laid hold of the bridle, which was held fast in the hand of a man lying on the ground, whom I supposed dead. What was my surprise when the cowardly poltroon dared to dispute the horse with me. Fortunately, Finlay Cameron, an officer in Lochiel's regiment, happened to pass near us. I called on him to assist me, and he immediately placed his pistol at the head of the man and threatened to blow out his brains. The fellow, who had the look of a servant, at once yielded the horse and took to his heels.
The Highland regiments in the Jacobite army had been routed, but the Battle of Culloden was still far from over. The Lowland units standing in the second line were rather a mixed bag, but there were some good regiments among them, and as the Highlanders came running back, a desperate fight began to protect their retreat. General Hawley's dragoons and the Highlanders of the Argyll militia were pushing into the Jacobite rear, threatening to encircle them. But James Moore, of Stonywood's Aberdeen regiment, played a major role in keeping the government cavalry at bay. It was about this time that the Pretender himself made his escape. Lord Elcho, the leader of his own bodyguard, called bitterly after him, "Run, you cowardly Italian!" With Elcho's cry ringing in his ears, he rode off the field with a small escort of French cavalry to look to his own destiny. The prince had spent most of the battle far in the rear, and now he was only intent on escaping to France as soon as possible. His followers were ungraciously ordered to fend for themselves. Even with the prince gone and the Highland regiment scattered, the remnants of the last Jacobite army continued its final death struggle. And in one of history's sad little ironies, the Scots soldiers of the French Royal Écossais in the Jacobite ranks exchanged fire for a time with the British Royal Scots of the government army. The brave actions of the Royal Écossais gave the fleeing MacDonalds the brief respite they needed to escape. But as government troops arrived, they were soon surrounded by cavalry, and after a fierce fight, which left half of them dead or wounded, they laid down their arms, surrendering as prisoners of war. Once the Royal Écossais had surrendered, there was nothing left to restrain the dragoons, and they mercilessly rode down the Jacobite fugitives. An indiscriminate slaughter of the fleeing men and women and children who followed in the wake of the army began, and continued all the way into Inverness. No mercy was shown in respect of age or sex, and many innocent civilians were brutally murdered in the ensuing bloodshed. Back on the field, the battle was now over, and Cumberland marched his infantry forward across the moor to stand on the ground formerly occupied by the Jacobites. By this symbolic act, he formally claimed his victory. Edward Glynn remembered the desperate events of the day.
It was a wee bit after 12 o'clock when the battle begun, and then by 1 o'clock it was all finished like. The Jacobites come up half a bold like in a muckle great burghy. They had their swords in their hands, but we could limit like a warm like volley and kept blazing away continuous with firelocks and with canister. They pretty soon retreated back again faster than they come. Then were dragoons that was in their right and left wings pursued with sword and pistol and cutting off a money of them down. And there was a pack thicker we did in yon place. We lost half a few men of our regiment, only a puckle wounded like. In fact, the army lost no more than about 200 killed and wounded altogether. We never had such good luck as this afore, and I thank God for it.
In all, the British Army lost a total of 50 killed at Culloden. On the other hand, something like 1,500 Jacobites were slain on the field, or cut down on the road to Inverness. Hundreds more of the Jacobite wounded were taken prisoner, and by evening, on the 16th of April, the British Army had no fewer than 326 Jacobite prisoners in its charge at Inverness, besides the 229 French regulars. Many of the Jacobites, wrote one officer, were desperately wounded. Indeed, over the next few days, the number of prisoners rose dramatically as the wounded Jacobites were brought in from the moor and fleeing fugitives were captured. Many of their later complaints about bad treatment alleged that wounds were left unattended. History has coloured the aftermath of Culloden as a savage frenzy of killing by an out-of-control government army. In fact, there was no systematic massacre of wounded men on the field directly after the battle. But a series of barbaric atrocities were undoubtedly committed in the days that followed by small groups and squads of government soldiers under the direction of their officers. There was an ugly rumour that the Jacobites had themselves ordered that no prisoners were to be taken if Culloden was a Jacobite victory. Cumberland himself referred to it in orders he issued, and this ensured that there was no sympathy for the wounded Jacobites still on the moor, and many of whom were killed in a barbarous fashion. Those Jacobites who were captured fared little better. They were guarded by the despised vestrymen, an unsavoury collection of petty offenders and other undesirables foisted upon the army by parish constables. It would be hard to find a worse or more brutal set of jailers. It was they who were responsible for many of the acts of cruelty and murder which followed Culloden. In the months which followed, many Jacobites were tried and executed, while hundreds more were transported to the American colonies, or, most ironic of all, conscripted into the British Army. Inevitably, for a man pledged to break the power of the clans forever, Cumberland's pacification of the Highlands was heavy-handed and brutal. The innocent suffered with the guilty, but the punitive expeditions served their purpose. The clans refused ever to rise in arms again. If there is a single shaft of redeeming light from the terrible aftermath of Culloden, it was this. Despite the vicious and inhuman excesses of the clearances, Scotland was spared forever the horror of another series of increasingly pointless rebellions. Most Scots of the time, like Edward Lynn and Patrick Crichton, thanked God for it.
We, your Majesty's most dutiful and loyal subjects, the noblemen, gentlemen, and freeholders of the Shire of Edinburgh, beg leave, with our hearts full of joy, to congratulate your Majesty on the victory obtained by His Royal Highness, the Duke of Cumberland, over the Jacobites on the 16th of April. The evils we felt during this wicked, unnatural and unprovoked rebellion, and the more dreadful evils we had reason to fear if it should prevail, the imminent danger we were in of being robbed of our religion, laws, liberties and properties, the complete overthrow of the Jacobites by the bravery of your own troops under the command of your heroic son, and the safety of his great life in the heat of action, all make this a glorious victory.